Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. And I can see that English is not the first language of the majority of people here, so I've written a very short talk and I'll read it slowly as I can. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers of the conference, the Central Monastic Body and the Centre for Bhutan Studies, as well as Dr. Ian Baker, for kindly inviting me to speak at this event. For the past year, my wife and I have been travelling in India, where we've visited nearly 20 libraries in search of manuscripts of yoga texts. In this paper, I will present my research on a Saiva yoga text called the Amaraga Praboda, of which we have found 7 manuscripts in South Indian libraries. The Amaraga Praboda is a Sanskrit work that attributes its teachings to Gorakshanatha, which whom Dr. Mallinson mentioned, the alleged founder of the Nata order and a pioneer of the physical type of yoga called Hatha Yoga. To begin with, I will explain how new manuscript evidence has enabled me to revise the date of the Amaraga Praboda and postulate that this work was probably one of the earliest texts to teach a type of yoga called Hatha Yoga. Its early date has much to do with the fact that it borrowed and adapted a significant amount of material from the Amrita Siddhi, a Sanskrit Vajrayāna work that was translated into Tibetan in the mid-12th century, and which Dr. Mallinson has so eloquently discussed, so I won't talk too much about the Amrita Siddhi. I'll focus on the Amaraga Praboda. I will focus on how the Amaraga Praboda adapted the Amrita Siddhi's teachings to formulate a type of yoga called Hatha for a Saiva audience. Saiva, by the way, means followers of the god Shiva. This will enable me to conclude by discussing some of the key insights into the early history of Hatha Yoga revealed by the relationship between these two texts. Okay. The Amaraga Praboda was published in 1954 by Kalyani Malik, whose edition is a transcription of one manuscript. This version of the text has 75 verses. In Christian Buoy's masterful work on a yoga text called the Hatha Pradipika, he observed that the Amaraga Praboda must have been composed prior to the mid-15th century because Svatmarama, the author of the Hatha Pradipika, borrowed 22.5 verses from it. As noted by Dr. James Mallinson in his publications, the Amaraga Praboda borrows at least 5 verses from the Amrita Siddhi. Therefore, it can be said with some certainty that the Amaraga Praboda was composed sometime between the 12th and 15th centuries. Previous attempts to date the Amaraga Praboda more accurately have settled for the 14th century, because the version of the text published by Malik is clearly a compilation that contains verses from other works on Hatha and Raja Yoga. These include the 11th century Raja Yoga text called the Monastic, on which I did my doctoral thesis, and a 13th century Hatha and Raja Yoga work known as the Doctoral Yoga Shastra. The Amaraga Praboda also quotes and mentions by name 2 unknown works, the Sri Samputta and the Amaraga Samsiddhi. Therefore, the version of the Amaraga Praboda in Malik's publication is clearly a compilation that was composed sometime after the earliest texts on Hatha and Raja Yoga, which began to emerge around the 12th and 13th centuries. However, new manuscript evidence found by the Hatha Yoga Project has brought to light a shorter version of the Amaraga Praboda. It has only 46 verses and omits the verses borrowed from other texts except for those of the Amrita Siddhi. That is to say, the short version does not contain the verses from the Monastic, the Doctoral Yoga Shastra, the Sri Samputta, and the Amaraga Samsiddhi. Moreover, the structure of the shorter version is more cohesive because it omits a passage of 18 verses at the end of the long version, which introduce new subject matter on the 5 elements, the Panchabhutas, sun and moon metaphysics, and the king of yogis, the Yogi Raj. For these reasons, I believe the shorter version is closer to the design of the original work, which based its Hatha Yoga on selected teachings of the Buddhist Amritasiddhi. Furthermore, owing to the early date of the Amritasiddhi's yoga and the rudimentary nature of the Amaraga Prabodha's short version, it is now probable that the Amaraga Prabodha was one of the earliest works to teach Hatha Yoga. As seen in the table, the Amaraga Prabodha teaches 4 types of yoga: mantra, laya, hatha, and raja yoga. The first 3 are said to be means to achieving the 4th, Raja Yoga, the so-called king of all yogas, which is defined in the Amaraga Prabodha as a meditative state free from mental activity. Hatha Yoga consists of practicing the 3 bodily mudras called Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda. These physical methods of yoga were adapted from the Amritasiddhi, as Dr. Mallinson mentioned. The Amaraga Prabodha describes Mahamudra as follows, and we can read this together. Having squeezed the perineum with the left foot and having held the extended right foot with both hands, the yogin should breathe in through the mouth. Having fixed the lock in the throat, and that's the chin lock where you press the chin down onto the chest, the yogin should hold the breath above, perhaps upwards in the upper torso. Just as a snake hit with a stick becomes straight like a stick, so the breath suddenly becomes a straightened Kundalini energy. Then she, who usually dwells as the breath in the 2 channels of Ida and Pingala, that's the left and the right nostrils, has a death-like state. The great afflictions and problems such as death are destroyed. For this reason, the most wise call it the great mudra. So here's a couple of images of Mahamudra. You can see that the yogin is in an asymmetrical position with one leg straight and the other bent. The heel of the bent leg presses against the perineum and the hands hold on to the extended leg while the torso is folded forward. Here's also perhaps from the same manuscript that a different folio though at the British Library that Dr. Mallinson showed that probably dates to the late 18th or early 19th century. It has the text of the Yoga Pradipika written on the back of each folio. So if one compares the description of Mahamudra in the Amaraga Prabodha with the Amritasiddhi, it is clear that both are describing the same technique, but the results are expressed quite differently. The Amritasiddhi states, having pressed the perineum carefully with the heel of the left foot, the yogin should hold firmly the right foot at the extended leg with the hands. Having raised his hips onto a seat, here I think it just means a mat, placed the chin on the chest, closed the 9 doors of the senses, breathed into the chest. He should focus the mind on the crossroads, which is probably the point between the eyebrows, and undertake control of the breath. Having devoured the flow of the moon and the sun, he should stop the breath. It removes impurity, retains semen and the inner resonance, the nada, causes prana to flow through all the channels and stimulates the fire in the body. Because of this mudra, everything that's good, I suppose, is sure to arise for yogins. By it, death is driven away. Therefore, it is always beneficial. So these 2 passages can be compared as follows. The words in purple indicate the sections that describe the practice. As you can see, the Amaraga Prabodha's description is more succinct. Although both use different syntax and terminology, it's clear that the technique is nonetheless the same. The words in red indicate the results of the practice. In this regard, the texts are very different. I'll mention only 2 of the significant differences. Firstly, the Amaraga Prabodha describes the forceful effect this practice has on the breath. Mahamudra is likened to a stick that is used to kill a snake. It strikes the breath and forces it to become a straightened, serpent-like energy. The notion that the breath can become Kundalini is an archaic one that can be found in earlier Saiva works. And secondly, the upward movement of the breath in the central channel and its cessation in the nostrils is an oblique reference, mentioned more explicitly in other yoga texts, to the onset of meditative absorption, in which the movement of the breath going in and out of the body stops. In contrast to this, the Amritasiddhi mentions the flow of nectar from the sun and moon in the body and the retention of semen and the inner resonance, which are salient themes of its yoga. As to whether the Amaraga Prabodha's verses on Mahamudra were borrowed from an earlier Saiva source that is unknown to us, or whether the Amritasiddhi's description was rewritten to incorporate Kundalini and meditative absorption, remains an unanswered question. What is clear, however, is that the author of the Amaraga Prabodha was concerned with incorporating Saiva metaphysics, such as Kundalini, and demonstrating the forceful effect of this type of yoga called Hatha. Also, you may have noticed that, unlike the Amritasiddhi, the Amaraga Prabodha does not mention that Mahamudra reverses the natural downward flow of semen, thus resulting in celibacy. In fact, the word for semen, bindu, does not appear in the Amaraga Prabodha's section on Hatha Yoga. A possible reason for this is that many Shaivas were not so interested in retaining semen as Vajrayāna Buddhists and other ascetics were. Whereas the nectar in the Amritasiddhi is clearly equated with semen in the male body, the flow of nectar in the Amaraga Prabodha is redefined to mean Raja Yoga, which is meditative absorption. So time does not permit me to compare in such detail the Amaraga Prabodha and the Amritasiddhi's teachings on the other two mudras, namely Mahabandha and Mahaveda. I will simply say that the techniques are the same, and the combined practice of these three mudras produces the same 4 stages of yoga and piercing of the 3 knots of Brahma, Vishnu and Rudra with prana, the 3 knots being depicted there, which are along the central channel. So the idea is that prana is moved into the central channel and it's forcefully pushed up and it pierces the 3 knots. By way of conclusion, I'd like to suggest that the relationship between the Amritasiddhi and the Amaraga Prabodha informs us of how Hatha Yoga emerged from tantric traditions. Bearing in mind that the Buddha rejected arduous acts of asceticism, as did Shaiva non-dual traditions that espoused easy methods for liberation, the Sukhopaya, it may well be the case that early Hatha Yoga arose from the efforts of tantrikas to fashion physical practices of yoga that did not afflict the body. Their motivation for doing so centered on the understanding that prana and semen could be physically manipulated within the body to attain samadhi and liberation with greater certainty than other methods. However, the widespread notion that forcefully manipulating prana was dangerous ultimately prevented this type of yoga from becoming a mainstream teaching in Shaivism and Vajrayāna. I'm inclined to think that the physical techniques of Hatha Yoga became more popular once they had been separated from Buddhist and Saiva doctrine, thus enabling gurus from various traditions to appropriate and adapt this physical yoga to suit their needs and beliefs. Comparing the Amaraga Prabodha with the Amritasiddhi demonstrates that a distinguishing feature of Hatha Yoga was its simplicity, which was made possible by the fact that physical techniques can be taught with minimal doctrine. The Amaraga Prabodha contains the nucleus of ideas for a type of yoga that was extracted from Vajrayāna and Shaivism. Its effectiveness and adaptability enabled it to flourish in India for over half a millennium. Nonetheless, as Hatha Yoga became a pan-Indic trans-sectarian practice, its identity changed, and in many cases it became little more than preliminary physical techniques in general conceptions of yoga. Thank you.